This video provides a very brief explanation of Connecticut's fiscal guardrails as of 2024. This is a subject that will be the topic of debate in the next legislative session, so a basic understanding of it is important. The fiscal guardrails impact state spending on the services it provides and aid it grants to the residents of the state. These services are very important for the well-being of everyone. They keep people safe, they provide assistance for vulnerable communities and ensure the physical and mental health of all residents. They provide expanded economic opportunities through education, development, and good infrastructure. The state also helps local governments and nonprofits to do the same. These state services and financial aid are especially important in Connecticut because it is one of the most unequal states in the nation. There are many residents who need state help and the opportunities the state can provide to lead better lives. For years, there were two main things that the state spent taxpayer dollars on. First was general budget expenditures that provided services and aid. The second is bond debt. This is to pay interest on loans provided by the issuance of bonds. These loans pay for large infrastructure projects like new buildings, schools, roads, bridges, and airports. In 1991, the legislature made an important change to state spending when it imposed a spending cap. This cap ensured that the state could not spend money on general budget expenditures much above what had been authorized for the previous year. And so all state spending on aid and state services had to be a dollar amount below the cap. Any surplus above the cap could only be spent on a few things: paying for debt on bonds or on pensions that had not been paid for years, or for savings. There was one exception. Aid to the poorest local governments, for example, Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven, could be paid with a surplus. This spending cap was not a problem for years. This was because a weak economy meant there were very few years with a surplus above the cap. But the economy began to pick up in 2017, so the legislature voted on another guardrail to limit state spending. They made a distinction between the types of revenue and taxes that the state collected. They decided that some revenue was stable, that was roughly the same every year, including income from wages, sales tax, and corporation tax. But other revenue was volatile, from capital gains, investments, dividends, and certain businesses. This revenue was tied to the stock market that could fluctuate widely from year to year. The legislature decided to impose a volatility cap on this revenue. Any revenue above a certain amount from those taxes could not be spent on services and aid, but could only go to debt and savings. What this meant was that surplus under the spending cap that might have gone to services simply disappeared. The legislature also made no exception for aid to distressed municipalities. So now the money for this also had to come from under the spending cap that used to go to state services. The point of the volatility cap was to save money, and it worked very well. Billions of dollars in surplus revenue was collected. It was again used to pay bond debt, but two other important things happened. It was used also to pay pension debt and to contribute to the rainy day fund. As more and more surplus revenue was collected as the economy got better, more and more was used to pay off the pension debt. So eventually by 2023, $7.7 billion had been paid to pay off the pension debt. There was still quite a bit of debt left, but this made a big dent in the pension debt that the state owned. The rainy day fund also increased tremendously. By 2022, it was up to $3.3 billion, which was in fact the legal limit that could be contributed. In fact, the state is continuing to add to the rainy day fund. In July 2024, it was announced that the fund would reach $4.7 billion. This, of course, is above the $3.3 billion legal limit, So the legal limit had to be increased from 15% of the general fund appropriations to 21%. But now there is $1.4 billion extra in the fund. There's a good reason to do this. The fund generates interest. So the bigger the fund, the more interest collected. By 2024, it might be 0.2 billion per year in interest collected from the fund. On top of this, as the pension debt is paid off, as payments are being made, this means that there's less pension debt owed, and this in turn increased the bond rating of the state. And what this means is that with a higher bond rating, loans can be offered to the state at a lower interest. So there is savings on interest paid on loans, perhaps $500 million per year. And in the end, this means there is total extra revenue of perhaps close to $750 million. Now, where this revenue is being spent is unclear. It is certainly not going directly to services and aid that help the people of Connecticut. So the guardrails produce a lot of saving, but at the expense of the people who rely on state services. In the end, in 2023, over $2 billion was not spent on services or aid. And not only was this money not spent on services on aid, money was taken away from the fund that can be used for those services and aid. Particularly, the distressed municipality cost is now being taken away from money that could have gone to services, and that money is shrinking. So the amount of money that can be used directly to help the people of Connecticut has been reduced. So in the end, even though state funding has increased, it has not increased enough to meet inflation or the cost of services. And the result of this is cuts to services and understaffing. This can be seen especially in this chart. Between 2019 and 2023, revenues collected by this state have increased tremendously. That's the blue line. But spending on state government and services, the orange line, has decreased. This means that the state government departments are having increasing problems providing enough services and high enough quality services. The lack of sufficient funding is also why the number of state employees has gone down by about 14,000 in 15 years. And with fewer employees, it's much more difficult to provide help for the residents of the state who need it. There's simply not enough money to hire these state employees or pay them enough to keep them. This is why overtime has increased, because of understaffing. And this has cost a lot of money. It's also very dangerous. This is especially unsafe for those people who work in difficult frontline jobs, like in prisons, mental health and addiction services, emergency services, and public protection. This explains why there are reports of shortages in funding in most state service departments, and why they're struggling to keep up the services they provide. This is also why recently there have been many stories about state worker shortages, especially in very important areas like healthcare, prisons, and even transportation. Clearly, even though there are some advantages for long-term savings from the guardrails, it is unclear that the amount of savings is necessary now or makes up for the immediate problems the guardrails are causing for the services that can be provided to the people of Connecticut. Because of this, some people advocate removing the guardrails altogether, but this would be very difficult. It would require 2/3 vote of both houses of the legislature and the approval of the governor, and most legislators, and especially the governor, are supportive of them. So recently talk is about adding more flexibility to the guardrails or loosening them. There are three main suggestions. One is to raise the volatility cap to free up some money that can be used for services. Another suggestion is to make an exception again for aid to distressed municipalities. If some of that aid can be above the cap, then it is possible to save money that can be used for services and other forms of aid. And finally, there are suggestions that perhaps the interest on the rainy day fund should be used for general budget expenditures, or that the savings from pension debt could be used for general budget expenditures. This would provide quite a bit of money that would really help the state services be able to do the job that they're intended to do, but it also would leave extra money to continue paying off pension debt and to continue contributing to the rainy day fund. Perhaps not to the extent that's been happening recently, but certainly they would still be able to do it. The fiscal guardrails are especially a problem for higher education. Reduced state funding has made cuts and tuition increases necessary in 2024. Temporary funding made up the deficit for 2025, but it will be gone in 2026. In the coming years, unless a sustainable source of state funding is found, we will face years more of cuts, impacting our ability to provide excellent education for all the residents of the state. For more information about the impact of the guardrails on higher education or on the guardrails themselves, please contact communications@csuaup.org. Thank you.